Next, we have one of the most energetic speakers ever, Dr. Raymond Cloyd. He always comes to my classes to give guest lectures, and my students cannot stop talking about him once he's gone, because he's very energetic. He's he's Dr. Cloyd, so what else can I say? So I'm here to introduce Dr. Raymond A. Cloyd. He's a professor and extension specialist in ornamental entomology, integrated pest management, Department of Entomology, Kansas State University. Dr. Cloyd is an extension specialist in horticultural and ornamental entomology for the state of Kansas. And Dr. Cloyd's research and extension program involves pest management in greenhouses, nurseries, landscapes, turf grass, conservatories, interior scapes, Christmas trees, and vegetables and fruits. His major clientele includes homeowners, master gardeners, and professional and commercial operators, and of course, JCCC students and faculty as well. When I looked at Dr. Cloyd's bio, it was so big I had to really, narrow it down to just a few more lines. He has published over 60 scientific referee publications and over 400 trade journals trade journals on topics related to pest management. Every symposium, every meeting I go to, he's one of the speakers, and everybody talks about him, all over Kansas. And he has co-authored and authored several books, some of which are here. I own a couple of them as well. And there are pocket guides, manuals, book chapters, everything he has authored or co-authored. And today he has handouts for all of you, so make sure you grab one of the handouts, and he will be discussing how insecticides work. Dr. Cloyd, you're welcome.
Thank you. Can you all hear me in the back? With that introduction, I'm done. Okay, basically, today's topic, I can't think of anything more exciting than talking about insecticides right after lunch and how they work. Can you? So we'll go ahead and get going. Everybody have the handout. Short budget shortages. I only can make so much, so if you can share, that'd be great. But thank Leica for inviting me to participate in this and talk about the presentation, overview. I don't have two of these, but we'll talk introduction, talk about the types and classes of insecticides, and then how they work, or most specifically, the mode of action, and hopefully there'll be some questions and discussion. Basically, right now, most everyone wants insects killed quickly. I call that the DDT mentality. It comes back from DDT. Nobody likes to have bugs on their plants. I don't know why. They're cool. But everyone wants them dead, and they want them dead fast. And so what happens is we've come a long way. Does anybody remember this? I forget her name, but there's a little kid, a little DDT dust, taking care of everything and stuff. And then, of course, how many remember when the kids used to go up, back and forth, and the DD truck was going along? Remember that? I don't know if we've gone backwards or forwards since Rachel Carson, but anyway, we have come a long way with some new selective products that are out there, and hopefully we'll talk about those. The first thing you have to understand in order to determine how these materials work is the feeding behavior. And this is the big five. This is the chewing insects, sucking. We also call them Pearson sucking, and depending on political correctness, that changes every year, 4 years sometimes. Mining, wood-boring insects, and galling insects. We get a little bit deeper into this. The phloem feeders are the ones that feed in the phloem, the food-conducting tissues. That's most of your sucking insects, aphids, whiteflies, mealybugs, soft scales, and leafhoppers. Also xylem feeders. Those are feeding in the water-conducting tissues. That's your true bugs, spittlebugs, leafhoppers. Chewers are beetles, caterpillars, and sawflies. Miners are the leaf miner. And then chlorophyll feeders are spider mites and lacebugs. And one of my favorites, they're all my favorites, but one of my favorites is thrips. And they kind of feed in the mesophyll epidermal fluid feeders. So in order to understand how these materials will be effective against these diversity of insect pests, you have to know how they feed overall, because that's going to impact how these materials will kill them. If you go a little bit deeper, we have the xylem, which is where the leafhoppers and certain other bugs feed. The phloem, which is where aphids and mealybugs and whiteflies primarily feed. And this is important when we talk about systemic insecticides. Systemic insecticides is one of the groups that will move in the xylem, get in the phloem, and kill a lot of your phloem-feeding insects, aphids, whiteflies, mealybugs, and soft scales. Spider mites, they're feeding in the palisade mesophyll cells and all those spongy mesophyll cells. They're removing chloroplasts. So in general, they're not susceptible to systemic insecticides. Thrips, they're feeding all over the place, and then leaf miners underneath the cuticle. So that just gives you kind of a really introductory to the feeding behaviors of most of these arthropods. Okay, pesticides. These are the types. We have contact, stomach poisons, systemics, and translaminar. This is how they work. Contact. They kill an insect. Whatever you spray or come in contact with, it kills it. There's no residual with most of these products, which means two things. One, you got to get great coverage, thorough coverage. Number two, multiple applications with contacts. Most, I would say 70% of the insecticides available to the homeowners and also professionals come under the category of contact pesticides. Again, they have to either get direct contact, or if they walk across any wet residues, that's when they'll be killed. And most of your materials out there fall into that category. Many of your pyrethroids, 7 is out there. All your oils, all your horticultural oils, all your soaps fall into that category. Pyrethrin, which is an organic-based material, also has contact activity. So these is most of the groups out there, the classes will cover, fall under contact pesticides. In this case, insecticides and miticides. Example is soap. Soap is a very classic example of a contact insecticide. Once the residue is dry, there's no killing effect at that point. So thorough coverage and repeat applications are generally required when using these materials. And there's a lot of information out there in the magazines. Some of it, a lot of it, not really true, about that the soaps are considered organic. That's a term that's more marketing. There's no such thing as an organic pesticide. But soaps and oils are what we classified as selective or softer materials more than, say, orthene or malathion and those types of products that are out there. And the active ingredient, what gets me excited, is the potassium salts of fatty acids. That's the killing agent. That's the active ingredient. The other ones are the oils. This is a petroleum-based oil, and all of your oils are considered suffocants. They smother the insect. They block the breathing pores, we call spiracles, so the insects die of asphyxiation and also mites. The benefit of oils is also the level of egg activity. Many of your oils are considered ovicidal. They will kill eggs, and that's one of the benefits, because most of the insecticides out there have minimal ovicidal activity against either mite eggs or insect eggs. So here's a petroleum-based one. Here's one, kills garden insects, year-round oil spray. I mean, look at that advertising, I love it. I know, but again, it's one of those contacts, and it kills whitefly, aphids, spider mites, mealybug, scale, mites, thrips, fungi, everything under the sun. We've done evaluations, and it doesn't kill all those insects. But they're mostly used on a wide diversity of ornamental horticultural crops. So they do, again, the smothering. Once the residues dry down, you got to come back and make the application again. 7 is, how many use 7 in here, or carbaryl? Some of you still do. It's probably the most widely used insecticide. It's also the most harmful to honeybees and most of your beneficials, but it's also a contact out there. And this is one of the examples of 7 out there. Has a little, maybe somewhat some systemic activity, but very limited. Mostly as a contact. Another one is sulfur. Sulfur is one of those sort of elemental materials. Sulfur is a great miticide. It's one of our oldest miticides out there. Also used for chiggers, also for thrips. That's what you put. You remember when you put, everybody know what chiggers are, right? You wrap some sulfur on your socks, and that does keep the chiggers away. But it's also a contact miticide more than anything else. The other group is stomach poisons, and these are ones in which the insect has to eat the active ingredient or the product. It has to eat the material in the leaves in order to be negatively effective. What happens inside the insect is, I'll show you in a minute, is it disrupts the stomach lining, and eventually they die. They die. Generally, they stop feeding within 24 to 48 hours, and then it takes about 3 to 4 days to finally kill them. So these are stomach poisons. And one of the most classic ones is dipel. Bacillus thuringiensis kirostaki. How many have heard of this product or have used it in the garden? Yeah, it's a very, what I call safe, benign material, because it only kills caterpillars. I mean, you can eat this stuff for lunch, and it would give you massive diarrhea, but you're not going to die. There's no doubt about that. But again, it's very selective for caterpillars. And basically, here's a tomato hornworm. Now, when you get to this point, it's too late to use dipel, because you want to use dipel when the caterpillars are young. But when they get to the size of a hot dog, it's too late. you might as well just pick them off, put them in some a little wok and then soy sauce. And actually, my daughter's eating these. They're better than hot dogs for protein base, but you can actually cook them and barbecue them with some aluminum foil, and they taste great with a hot dog bun. So in this case, it's too late. You have to apply dipel when they're young. You think I'm kidding? That's organic, right? They're eating these bugs is organic, basically. So how does this work? I love to talk about this just right after lunch. You're spraying a spore. You're spraying the spore on the insect, on the leaf. What happens is that caterpillar comes along, eats part of that leaf. It gets inside of the gut, which is alkaline. That's what stimulates it, because our stomach is acid. It's hydrochloric acid. That's why it doesn't work on our stomach. And then it's converted into the protoxin. And what that protoxin does in the gut is it latches on to these receptors on the epithelium or the gut lining. And what they do is they release enzymes, and they actually inhibit water permeability, and the gut contents pour into the bloodstream, and they die of septicemia. The video is awesome when you see this right after lunch, particularly. And then they die. That stops them from feeding, and then they die within about 3 to 5 days. But again, this only works in caterpillars, and it will kill good caterpillars as well as bad caterpillars. If you see a monarch butterfly larva or a viceroy or the swallowtails eat this, they will be toast. They will die, basically, because of that. Okay? But very selective, and this is what's happening is we're seeing a lot more selective materials being introduced into the market. We're getting away from some of the more broad-spectrum materials. Another one is spinosad. Spinosad has been around since the 1990s. That's the active ingredient. I'm only going to give you the active. The trade name doesn't mean very much to me as a scientist. It's the active. That's what gets me excited at night. I mean, reading about the active and what it does. But spinosad is very effective against 3 groups of insects: thrips, caterpillars, and leaf miners. Thrips, caterpillars, and leaf miners. It's very good, but it is stomach poison. It does have some contact activity, but it's primarily an ingested material is how it works the best. Okay? There's another. This is, again, gets me excited. There's spinosad A and spinosad D. Spinosad A is the one that pretty much gives you the best activity against most of the insects that are out there. Okay? So these are examples of stomach poisons. The next one is a very interesting group. I've been given several talks, and I'll be given more talks. It's systemic pesticides. And these are ones in which you apply them as a foliar or to the growing medium or soil. They're taken up by the roots, and then they move throughout the plant like your blood system. It's a closed system, and they're mostly used against phloem-feeding insects because the active ingredient gets moved into the phloem. It's traveled through the xylem, the transpiration stream, and then moves through the phloem. There's a term called biomembrane permeability. You don't need to remember that. But biomembrane permeability means it allows the xylem contents to flow get in the phloem, and that's where aphids, whiteflies, and leafhoppers and mealybugs are feeding. Systemic insecticides provide some benefits. Long residual activity. You can sometimes get 8 to 12 weeks of residual with one application. They're not susceptible to UV light degradation or rainfall. It's a closed system, and they're less harmful to workers and employees, and also sometimes natural enemies that are out there, even though that is still debatable. So how does this work? You can apply them as a foliar or to the growing medium, and they basically move throughout the plant tissues through the xylem, the transpiration stream. Then they get into the phloem and into the areas of the plant where the phloem-feeding insects. Now, they will also work on leaf miners and certain leaf-feeding beetles. Elm leaf beetle would be one example, ones that really chew on the foliage. Japanese beetle also will be negatively affected when it feeds on a lot of these leaves if it ingests lethal concentrations of the active ingredient. So that's how these work. It's a closed system moving out, and the main benefit is you get extended residual activity with one application. This is showing you the soil application. The roots have to absorb it, and then it moves throughout the plant. You can apply them as a foliar. The downside of applying with a foliar is you don't get the residual activity. You might get about 4 weeks of residual with a foliar, but you do get quicker kill because these also have contact activity. A lot of these products that are systemics also have contact activity, but the strength is in their systemic activity. Here's an example of an aphid, an oleander aphid, feeding right in those phloem sieve tubes. It sucks up an active. The active gets into the metabolism of the insect and eventually kills it. That's how it works. Now, these are the materials out there that have systemic properties. Orthene has been around for a while. It's a long time. It's a well-known systemic. This one, acetamiprid, chlorantropinol, and these are all classified, we call them neonicotinoids. Acetamiprid, clothianidin, dinetefuran, imidacloprid, which you should know, and thiamethoxam are in the chemical class neonicotinoid. It's one of our newest ones that's out there, and these all have systemic properties, systemic activity. I'm sure many of you have seen these on some of the containers. How many are familiar with imidacloprid? Yeah, widely used. It's off patent now, so it's in all sorts of generics, but that's what's out there for systemic activity. Now, this is an example of acephate. It's got the insect control systemic. Acephate is the active ingredient in that product right there. This is imidacloprid. Of course, Bayer used to have imidacloprid, so it's in a lot of their products. This is the old all-in-one rose and flower care, and if you study the label like I do, how many in here read the label of a pesticide? Well, most of you are lying. That's all right. I understand that. Nobody reads the label except probably me, but the label has a lot of good information out there. This is a new one that came out last year by Bayer. What they did is they put two neonicotinoids together, imidacloprid and clothianidin. So this is what I think what's happening in the pesticide industry is almost like the Walmart syndrome. One-stop shopping. You buy one product, it kills everything. They also have a systemic fungicide called tebuconazole. So we're starting to see a lot of these, one product controls everything. Unfortunately, that's not the way it works. But this is a new one that came out last year where I'm concerned because two of the products have the same mode of action, imidacloprid and clothianidin, and of course, if you expose the populations to that continuously, you could get resistant individuals in the population occurring, and that can be a problem. What you probably don't know, and this is good beer party information, is that many of your materials are converted into the called metabolites or pro-insecticides, which are actually more toxic to the insects. Acephate is converted into something called methimidophosph, and that is much more active on whiteflies and aphids than actually acephate itself is. So a lot of the systemic insecticides are converted into something more toxic, and it's also more water-soluble than the actual active ingredient. Acephate is one example. Imidacloprid is another one. It's converted into 3 metabolites. Olefine, which is 16x, 16 times more toxic on aphids and whiteflies than imidacloprid itself. And then there's the 4 and 5-hydroxy. Those are also some metabolites that are converted inside the plant. And then thiamethoxam is interesting. This is a product that's sold in the homeowner market. Thiamethoxam is converted into clothianidin. So it's actually converted into another of the neonicotinoids out there. And the reason is because clothianidin is much more toxic than thiamethoxam is. Much more toxic as in terms of a neonicotinoid. Actually, it's the most toxic neonicotinoid out there. And it's the one in Europe that got into sunflowers and canola and actually inhibited honeybees. And that's why it's banned from France and Germany, because of the issues with the honeybees, which we have right here with colony collapse disorder. And that's another topic. Okay, so the bottom line is ELISA are converted into pro-insecticides. The last group are the translaminar. These are a little misunderstood, and I think the best thing is to show you what the image looks like. When you spray a product that has translaminar activity, it actually penetrates the leaf, and then even after the residues dry down, it stays in the leaf with a little residual activity, sometimes up to 7 days, maybe up to 14. So after the residues dry and say an aphid comes along, sticks its mouth parts in there and sucks up some juice, it can be negatively killed. It's not a systemic. It's what we call a localized systemic. Stays just within the leaf, and you get about maybe 7 to 14 days of residual. So again, the material penetrates the leaf tissues, the cuticle, the epidermis, and then you get a reservoir of active within the leaf. So even after the residues dry down, you do get some maybe lethality for maybe 7 to 10, maybe sometimes 14 days. So what the products that have that are, or most of your systemics are also translaminar. Orthene is one. All of your neonicotinoids have that activity, and then spinosad has that same. Spinosad has activity, and that's why it's good on leaf miners, because of that translaminar activity. Goes through the leaf, comes in direct contact with the leaf miner larva, and they are dead when they come in contact. And these are just some of another one is Captain Jack's brew. How many have heard of Captain Jack's brew? That's also spinosad, and that's also got translaminar activity. Okay? Now, let's talk about nerve toxins versus non-nerve toxins. These are all chemical classes. Organophosphates, carbamates, pyrethroids, neonicotinoids, and botanicals. All of these have nerve toxins. They work on the central nervous system or a component of the central nervous system. Unfortunately, insects and humans share a similar CNS, central nervous system. That's why many of these are toxic to insects but also toxic to us, because we do share that central nervous system with insects. And so the first two groups are the organophosphates and the carbamates. Malathion, orthine, this is Dursban. These all have the same mode of action. And we'll talk about that. I'm going to save the juicy stuff later, because what I'm giving you, you can get books on this. I'm going to give you a snapshot of this as opposed to giving you the book format. And so what's just important to understand is that these have the same mode of action, so you never use them in succession. Carbaryl is what? What's carbaryl? What's the trade name for carbaryl? 7, that's right. And of course, I thought that was gone, but there is one product that still has Dursban in it. Does anybody know what trichlorophon is? What? Dialox, good, trade name for Dialox. The other group is the pyrethroids. This makes up about 60% of the homeowner market. Now, pyrethroids work in a different target site than organophosphates and carbamates, but they all work in the nervous system. And you can see a lot you're pretty familiar with: cyfluthrin, permethrin, bifenthrin. A lot of these are used in turf, ornamentals, and also for homeowner products. In your wasp or hornet sprays, you'll see a lot of pyrethroids. The downside for pyrethroids is they are very toxic to cats. I'm not a cat lover, but anyway, that gypsy lost all 9 lives with one application. The reason is because pyrethroids are very toxic at low concentrations. Low concentrations. And so when a cat licks itself or cleans itself, I mean, it's gone. I mean, it's history. You know, you might as well get the shovel out. It's time to bury it at that point. So we'll talk about where these work when we get into the meat of it, the real fun stuff, you know, how these things actually kill insects. All your neonicotinoids I mentioned, they're also nerve toxins, and I'll show you on a diagram where they work. We pretty much talked about these. They're all systemic. Now, all of these you can apply to the soil except for one, and that is acetamiprid. You can only apply it as a foliar, and that's why in the homeowner market it is sold as an RTU, ready-to-use formulation. Okay? So those are the neonicotinoids. Now, this is strange. People talk about if it's natural, it must be safer for you in the magazines and stuff. Well, your botanicals, pyrethrin, they're nerve toxins. And some of these things are more toxic than some of our other products that are out there. Pyrethrin, rotenone, and nicotine are out there. Botanicals, rotenone and pyrethrin are probably the two common ones. If you know rotenone, it's a really potent fish killer, but it also works on the same target site as Parkinson's disease. And that's why rotenone is now being shoved off as an organic or safe material, because rats or mice that have been exposed to rotenone exhibit the same symptoms of Parkinson's disease. And the reason is because rotenone attacks the same target site as Parkinson's disease does in humans. So it's no longer considered organic or safe or whatever. It's actually, people are trying to forget about it. Okay, what about some non-nerve toxin materials? Those ones that attack the central nervous system somewhere. Well, there is a diversity of these. Insecticidal soaps, they're desiccants. They disrupt the membrane of the mite or insect, and it loses water and it dries up, and it's dead at that point. Oils are suffocants. They smother the insect or eggs, block the spiracles, breathing pores, and the insect dies. Selective feeding blockers are those materials that actually, there are not too many available, that they block the mouth parts of the insect and it can't feed. It's like if you went to your favorite junk food restaurant and ordered a milkshake and you sucked on the straw, if you put your finger over that, that's how these work. It's a physical mode of action. It's a very physical mode of action, but it does it starves them. They can't take up material and they die of starvation. Microbials, bacteria, that would be Bacillus thuringiensis, that would be dipel, would be an example of a bacteria. And then other organisms, that would be spinosad. Spinosad is actually also considered a microbial. Insect growth regulators, there are several of them out there. These are products that only kill the larval stage or immature stage of insects. They don't kill the eggs, they don't kill the adults, and they don't work nothing works in the pupa stage, but they only kill directly the immature stage. So timing is very critical. And then the last group are these plant-derived essential oils, which we've done a lot of work in the last 5 years, and we'll talk a little about them too. So these are the ones that really have very distinct, very broad, we call modes of action. Okay? Here's an example of insecticidal soap I showed you, 2% formulation. It's got that omri. It's for organic gardening, which really doesn't mean very much, but it's a desiccant. It's a desiccant. And I sometimes get this question in magazines that say, well, these are safe on beneficials. And the answer is no. You spray a green lacewing larva or adult with this, and it's toast. It'll kill it. So these do not discriminate between the good and bad bugs. They just don't have long residuals like some of those other products I talked about. Like orthene, for example. You spray orthene, you probably get 4 weeks of residual activity. So no natural enemies will come back into that environment. This is azadirachtin. Now, azadirachtin is a very interesting compound. The azadirachtin is derived from the neem tree, Azadirachta indica, and from the seeds. That's what that shows right there. Azadirachtin is one component of the neem seeds, and it is the insect growth regulator. It is also a repellent. In fact, that's its strength. Those are materials that repel insects away from the plants. So, but this is the insect growth regulator, which means it only works on what stage? The immature or larval stages overall. Okay? And the strength of azadirachtin is at caterpillars. Azadirachtin is probably most effective against caterpillars than any other insect group. Now you'll see it labeled for, like it says here, beetles, caterpillars, and aphids, and leaf miters, and thrips, and whiteflies. And I can tell you from our studies, it does not kill most of those insects, those groups. But caterpillars, that is its strength, Okay? Now, this is neem oil. Now, people they say neem, but you're talking about the oil or the azadirachtin, because they both come from the neem seeds. Neem oil is a suffocant. It's a clarified hydrophobic extract of neem oil. It's actually the suffocant. Azadirachtin is the insect growth regulator repellent. And there's a lot of misinformation in a lot of the web and everything else that when they say neem, they're talking about this. No, this is very distinct. Azadirachtin is distinct from the neem oil, which is actually the suffocant. Okay? Plant-derived essential oil products. There are a lot of them. Does anybody use these or have seen these in the literature? They're all over the garden centers and stuff. But these are actually derived from plants. Certain plants that are out there, rotenone and pyrethrin, and also nicotine would fall in this group. But there's a lot of new formulations out there. And they're actually obtained from steam distillation of the plant leaves. That's how you actually get them, by through steam distillation. And the really interesting thing about these plant-derived oils is their broad spectrum of insect activity. They're anti-fedants, some of them. They inhibit molting and respiration. They actually reduce growth and fecundity of insects. They actually disrupt the cuticle disposition. And they actually are classified as nerve poisons because they act on the octopamine pathway of the central nervous system. They work differently than everything else we've talked about, but they actually are classified as, they actually work as nerve toxins by attacking this octopamine pathway in the central nervous system. Okay? Isn't that cool stuff? I could talk about this for days. So, any questions about that? Now we get into really deep stuff. Okay, really deep. Mode of action. Mode of action is how the pesticide, the active ingredient, kills an insect or mite by metabolically or physiologically disrupting the processes there. That's a very, I would classify, general term for mode of action. There's a lot to it more than that. But that is how the material kills the organism. And the way I think about mode of action is just like football. If you are the offense and the insects are the defense, what you're trying to do is use different modes of action to minimize the prospects of resistance. So I apologize for putting Texas up here. I know a lot of people don't think highly of them, neither do I. But if you do running plays to the right or left, center, that's mode of action. You're trying to throw the insects off balance. And the reason I bring this up is because if you use, for example, malathion every time you spray, you're going to do what? Pardon? Yeah, because you continually select out resistant individuals. You've wiped out all the susceptibles, so all you're left with are resistant individuals to that mode of action. So the football analogy is by rotating different products with different modes of action, you minimize the prospects of resistance. And it does occur in spider mite populations, in aphid populations, in mealybug populations. It occurs out there. Not only in insects, but also the medical field. Why do you think doctors are sweating it right now? And why do you think tuberculosis and methicillium-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, that rolls right off my tongue, man, I love saying that. Why do you think they're so prevalent? Because penicillin doesn't work. Overuse of antibiotics is going to result in the same thing, resistant organisms. And that's why some of these older ones, like tuberculosis, is coming back, because they're resistant to streptomycin, penicillin, all the antibiotics that were used against them. Fungus, fungi, and weeds, the same thing. You overdo it, that's why we got Roundup-resistant weeds. Using the same mode of action every time, you select out for resistant individuals, and you can no longer deal with the population. Okay? Okay, so now we talk about narrow versus broad spectrum. Narrow spectrum is site-specific. Those work on somewhere in the central nervous system, and we talked a lot about those. Many of those chemical classes we talked about, like the organophosphates, carbamates, the pyrethroids, they're narrow spectrum. They work on a specific target site in the insect. The broad spectrum ones are those like oils and soaps, and those work on sort of a multitude of factors. They don't work on one specific site. They work on multiple sites or have a very, we call it, obscure mode of action. And it would take an insect a long time to develop resistance to these types of modes of action. Not impossible, because insects don't read the books. And insects are not stupid. They've evolved to somehow they were here before we were, so they're going to be here even when we're gone. So we have narrow spectrum and then broad spectrum modes of action. Go through this slowly. This is a diagram. Most of your insecticides work in this area called the nerve ganglia. And you can see the pyrethroids, organophosphates or carbamates are working in that one tiny region of the insect. Oils and soaps, they kind of work smothering and desiccants. Insect growth regulators, kind of obscure, but a lot of the action takes place right in this area called the nerve ganglia, and that's why it doesn't take an insect population a long time to develop resistance if you continue to use the same mode of action over and over again. Okay? Now, chlorinated hydrocarbons, that was the old DDT relatives, and they're all gone now. Kelthane was the last one. It's gone. Kelthane had a similar mode of action as the pyrethroids. And so sometimes when people struggle to deal with a population of, say, aphids that have been exposed to, say, kelthane or thiodan endosulfan, and they start using a pyrethroid, well, that population may have already developed resistance to that mode of action. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, a little bit deeper. I'm going to hold my enthusiasm, but this is cool stuff. Okay, now we get deeper. Let's talk about the nerves. We have the axon here. Then there's a gap called the synapse, and then there's this receptor site called the dendrite. What happened? This is where all the action takes place. This is the sodium-potassium channel. Right here is where all of your pyrethroids work. Right there, in that right there. And these are all receptor sites. We're going to come back to this. But these are all the receptor sites. This is an area where there's a term called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters. And a lot of your insecticides, they will block these neurotransmitters and either prevent the nerve system from going in, basically the pulses are firing, or actually keep them going. And we'll talk more about that. Okay? A more detailed look at this. Again, this is again the synaptic cleft, and these are just all these different target sites. Again, this is how the insecticides are working, killing the insect pests by latching onto some of these target sites. Again, I could sit there and watch this for hours. I love this stuff. But there it is right there. Okay, all of your organophosphates are carbamates. You don't need to memorize all this, but they are classified as acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. They inhibit the enzyme, this enzyme here, from clearing or degrading that neurotransmitter. Okay, I'll show you an image in a minute. But we call them acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. All organophosphates, carbamates. This is how they do their job. Pyrethroids. What they do is they prolong the opening of the sodium channels. That's why it's highlighted in yellow. That's all you need to know. This other stuff's for me. But all your pyrethroids are considered prolonging the opening of the sodium channel. This is how they're killing insects. Let's show you the diagram. Okay. The pyrethroids are working on the sodium and chlorine channels right there. They either do two things. They keep them open or they delay the closing. Some of them work differently, depends on the pyrethroid. But that's how they work. Right here is where the pyrethroids are working. Now, what about the organophosphates or carbamates? In the normal, right here, this is an enzyme. And what that enzyme does is it removes this neurotransmitter. That's acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter. What the organophosphates and carbamates do is they latch onto that. And so the enzyme doesn't remove the neurotransmitter, and guess what happens? Continual firing of the nerves, the insect dies of insectation paralysis, loss of energy, and dies. That's how those two groups kill insects. Any questions? Overwhelming. It's beautiful. Absolutely, Nance. If you, by chance, get either acute or chronic poisoning, we share this nervous system. For example, if you are using malathion or orthine, and you get some on your skin, be dermal, or you inhale it oral, this is what would happen to you. The organophosphate would prevent the acetylcholine neurotransmitter from stopping. It would stay in there, and so you would get excitation, hyperexcitation, all those typical symptoms that occur. So yes, these would occur in humans as they do in insects. Not specific, that's right, okay? So, you know how insecticides work? That's it right there. That's the target site. Now, what about the neonicotinoids? Now in yellow, they are classified as nicotinic acetyl receptor disruptors. They act on the central nervous system. They block the postsynaptic enzymes. That's how they work. That's their killing agent. And they'll do the same to humans. Same to humans, okay? And then spinosad. Now, a spinosad is a fascinating compound. Spinosad has two modes of action. It's a nicotinic acetyl receptor agonist and a gamma amino butyric acid or GABA chloride channel activator. People don't recognize that, but then actually spinosad is a very interesting compound. I worked with that compound for 4 years before it even came out. It has two modes of action. It's one of the few that does have that. Now, where does it work? Okay, let's go back to this diagram. This is the one that gets me excited at night. Now again, this is where the pyrethroids are working. This is where the organophosphates, carbamates are working. Okay, what about the neonicotinoids? Right there. That's the nicotinic acetyl receptors right there. There's the GABA receptor. This is where the neonicotinoids work, and this is where spinosad works, right in between there. That little space right there is where 90% of your insecticides are working. Nerve toxins, okay? Any questions about that? Now, this is where the organophosphates work upon. Now, spinosad. This is where spinosad gets a little issues about cross resistance. It works right in between there. So it's very likely that if you get a population of insects resistant to spinosad, they might also become cross-resistant, which means resistant to the same mode of action, to the neonicotinoids. And that's always a concern for us. That's always a concern. Okay? So how do you avoid developing resistant populations of insects or mites? What do? Rotate different modes of action. Now, where do you get that information? Does the label have that? Nope. You want to get on something called, I'm going to tell you this, the IRAC website. IRAC stands for the Insecticide Resistance Action Committee, which I'm a member of, and they have a website, and you can find all the modes of action for the insecticides. The Insecticide Resistance Action Committee. Now, I've got some publications, fact sheets that are out there, but if you want to use the web, that's what you want to look. They will have the mode of action for every labeled insecticide and miticide. And you can use that to figure out which ones you don't want to put back to back. Okay? So that's where it goes. Then again, somebody asked me about rotenone. Where does rotenone work? Right there. It works on the mitochondria. It inhibits respiration, and that's the same target site for Parkinson's disease, right there. Okay? So rotenone, it's fairly toxic. I mean, the LD50 of rotenone is lower than malathion 7. It's one of our most toxic botanicals out there. So if somebody tells you that natural is safer, you can tell them where to go, because that's not true. Okay? Any questions on that? I think that's about it on the. Yeah, because this is those of you that are struggling with your social life, you're lonely. Rent this movie. Has anybody seen this? Yay! It's a good movie. It's classic. I have seen this since I was a kid, 253 times now. I've seen it all over. I have 2 copies of everything. It's about gigantic ants that consume humans. You got to rent it. It's a 1954 movie. It stars James Whitmore, Mr. Miracle Grow, James Arness, who died recently, Matt Dillon, Gunsmoke, Leonard Nimoy, Mr. Spock, has a 15-second slot in that movie, and then Fess Parker, who played Davy Crockett, he also is in this movie. But it's a classic. I mean, it's the first big bug movie that came out, and it's still the best one. Now, that lady back there raised her hand. Would you agree with me? Yeah, it's black and white. Yeah. I mean, there's no computer special effects. This is how they did it back then. Large makeup models. They used fans to move the head and bodies around. I know everything about that movie, but it's class. So if your social life is in the doldrums, rent this. It'll get you excited, and you'll learn a lot about bugs too. So there's my content information. Do you guys have a lot of fun learning about how insecticides work? Good. So with that, I thank you. Are there any questions and for discussion? Thank you very much. Yes, sir. Great question, and the gentleman's question was, are there any systemic insecticides that you can use on vegetable food crops that will not get in the fruit? And the answer really is no. I do not like using systemics for fruit and vegetables, and unfortunately, Bayer registered one 2 years ago with imidacloprid, and I don't recommend it. The problem is that you don't know how much is going to get in there, and I would be very leery of using a systemic on a fruit or vegetable crop. That is just one of the reasons. The other one is the impact on pollinators. We do that. Some pollinators, some systemics will get in the flowers and either repel them, or they'll ingest, when they're eating the nectars and pollen, they actually ingest the active ingredient and can be negatively affected. So that's the question. I don't recommend systemics. Though we have some pretty good materials out there, I don't think we need systemics. Yes, ma'am. Good question. Are there any pesticides that are safe to use around honeybees? The question should be turned around, when should you apply pesticides to have a negative effect on honeybees? Generally, you want to apply them in the early morning or late in the evening. And because honeybees are active during the heat when it's warm and sunny because of their metabolism. So if you want to minimize your impact on honeybees, just time your applications in the early morning or very late in the evening. But in terms of products that you could use that will have minimal direct impact, soaps and oils, unless they come in direct contact with them, are going to have minimal impact on honeybees. Pyrethroids, they're pretty detrimental to honeybees. Even pyrethrin, which is the organic-based product, also is very toxic to honeybees. It nukes them. And some of the other organophosphates, 7 particularly. Never use carbaryl 7 around honeybees. It is the most toxic material on honeybees and will kill them outright. So 7 is one of our most toxic materials for honeybees. And bumblebees, any of the pollinators. Leafcutter bees, all those types. Yes, ma'am. Well, I know what it did. It kept the vampire bats away. And her question was, what about making your own home remedy pesticide, which is Jerry Baker, and mixing garlic or onions in a thing? You should frown away from that. First of all, you don't even know what the impact's going to be. And the best thing is to use products that are EPA registered. There's a lot of misinformation about those. Compost teas, soaking garlic and then using it as a repellent. Well, you don't even know how much is constant, what the concentration is. So the best use of your time is to go and find a product that's EPA registered and read the label. That's get educated. That's the best. Don't try to make your own concoctions because I think you'll be wasting your time. Yeah, that's a great question too. I get that a lot. I dread those questions too. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think that plants have an immune system similar to what we have?
Do plants have an immune system similar to what we have in terms of what now? I'm trying to maybe.
Develop resistance, or not resistance, but their own system to fight off insects?
Oh, absolutely. The great question is, do plants have their own natural defense against insects? Absolutely. In fact, that is what those botanicals, that is what we're using, is the plant's own defensive ability. Is they produce compounds. They produce there are two types of defenses, qualitative and quantitative. One of those is they produce like alkaloids, cyanic glycosides, their own poisons, and those are directly toxic to the insects. There's another group that produces lignins and tannins, and those are what we call digestibility inhibitors. The insect eats it and they get sick. So yeah, that's why a lot of times we promote the use of plant-resistant varieties, because they already have the ability, some of them, to defend themselves. It depends on the insect and the level of defense that they have. And humans have used many of those. Now the insects, we call adaptive radiation. They will evolve their own system to overcome that, and then the plants are producing that. So yeah, the plants have their own systems, whether qualitative or quantitative, to defend themselves against insects. And it's really too bad we don't do more breeding for that overall, because I think that's one way to reduce the use of pesticides in gardens, homes, or whatever, is putting plants that can tolerate, there's no really true resistance, but tolerate certain insects. And that's the best way to alleviate the aspects of pesticides. Yeah. Any other questions? Those are actually really, really good questions overall. Thank you very much.